The Iliad and environmental catastrophe. The war in Ukraine has already caused many thousands of deaths. Journalists and poets are already drawing parallels with the tragic conflict portrayed in the greatest classical war poem, the Homeric Iliad. Now, this ancient Greek epic has, in the 21st century, reached wider audiences and penetrated to deeper levels of popular culture than ever before through cinema and TV adaptations, feminist reappraisals, fiction, poetry and computer games. And as we watch the bombardment of Ukrainian cities and the terror of refugee women and children, the tears of the widowed Andromache in the Iliad feel more agonisingly relevant than at any time since World War II. But the poem not only foresees innumerable fatalities and the annihilation of Trojan civilization, it also predicts the total depopulation of what's now northwestern Turkey. And it describes aggressive and irreversible Bronze Age deforestation to provide the vast amounts of timber needed to support both naval and land militias. Now, there's always been cavalier abuse of natural resources by humans in conflict. Within a few months, the Russian invasion destroyed substantial parts of the Ukrainian infrastructure and poisoned its trees and forests. But it's also causing irreversible damage to the global environment. The terrible urgency of this new war has pushed the environmental crisis disastrously much further down humanity's list of priorities. But the conflict is also directly and immeasurably exacerbating pollution. The Washington Post reports on the untold volumes of toxins and pollutants recently released into the atmosphere. Cluster bombs and thermobaric rockets ignite massive clouds of poisonous aerosols. Wildfire risk and biodiversity loss will blight Ukraine for generations, but it'll also blight the whole world, bringing food crises and threats of radiation from damaged nuclear plants reaching across Eastern Europe and poisoning the Baltic, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And of course the war's sent oil and gas prices soaring, incentivising searches for new natural sources. Fuel providers are cynically using the war as an excuse to make a high carbon future unavoidable. Now, the Iliad can help us fight back against this terrible new stage in the history of humanity. A new green reading of the Iliad can show that the seeds of environmental catastrophe were already sown by warfare at the dawn of civilization. This foundational text in the culture of our planet can be instrumentalised in our attempt not only to prevent World War III, but to rescue our planet from disaster. I'm writing a book arguing that the Iliad exposes the contradictions which underlie the environmental crisis which we humans have created. It is the foundational document of the mindset of the Anthropocene. The most influential interpretation of the Iliad in modern times so far has been Simone Weil's essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, written in 1939. And it informed such influential receptions of the Iliad as Auden's pacifist poem, The Shield of Achilles. And I'm in complete agreement with Weil's identification of human physical compulsion and violence and their tragic consequences as the central subject matter of the epic poem. Yet, in the 21st century, we know that we face an existential threat in the destruction of our natural environment and that war itself exacerbates ecological disaster. And locked up in the poetry of the Iliad is a profound awareness of the terrible original damage by deforestation, metallurgy and agriculture that humans did inflict and will continue to inflict on the planet if our opacity towards nature is not ameliorated fast. David Attenborough has described historical deforestation as the crucial blow to the Mediterranean. And Simon Sharma in Landscape and Memory talks of cultural reforestation, where the literary and visual imagination works to replant diminished woodlands in fiction. Shakespeare's plays offer the Forest of Arden at the very time when British deforestation was becoming irrevocable. But in the Iliad, there's little attempt even to imagine a more harmonious relationship between humans and the environment. The loggers' axes resound cacophonously in every episode. Many of us feel helpless in the face of ruthless dictators, grim prognoses about the environment, carbon emissions, climate change, rising sea levels, drought and human exacerbation of natural catastrophe. And so I'm writing this book in the hope that it makes classical culture immediately relevant and interpreting it to constructive use. Reading canonical literature ecologically can't save the planet, but it just might help keep the cultural focus on ecological issues. Now, We's essay eerily anticipated the genocides and wholesale destruction of entire cities by both conventional and nuclear bombs, which, when she was writing, humankind was about to inflict on itself in World War II. And it was the most influential example of the new revulsion, first appearing at the dawn of the 20th century, against the Iliad's glorification of martial violence. It had taken the carnage of the Boer War and especially the Western Front trenches for the warriors of the Iliad to be reassessed and dislodged from their plinths as exemplars of manly heroism. And more recently, from the very late 20th century onwards, it was the rise of feminism in both scholarship and public culture, for the plight of the epic's women locked in the brutal patriarchal system of commodity exchange it depicts. Those are what produced the gender-sensitive readings that these rape victims deserve. See, for example, the best-selling novels by Pat Barker and Natalie Haynes. And at the same time, the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea has seen in the Homeric epics clear evidence of the symptoms of PTSD. That's Achilles in Vietnam. But our new awareness of the urgency of the ecological crisis makes it an even more pressing need for a green reading of the Iliad, which foregrounds the Homeric warriors' rapacity towards their natural environment. Timber. At the final emotional climax of the Iliad, after 40 days of conflict, brutality and emotional agony, Priam orders the Trojans to collect wood for the dead Hector's pyre. It's to be a great pyre, fitting for the best of the Trojans. The men of the city go out to the mountains, and for 9 days they collected immeasurable amounts of wood. And that Greek word unmeasurable here, aspetos, literally means too great to be spoken of, or infinite. Homer uses it elsewhere of cosmic elements like the sky or the stream of ocean or the waters of the sea. And the early philosopher Empedocles used it to describe the infinity of time. So Homer's choice of epithet here reveals a secret about the worldview of the 8th century BCE when his epics reached their final form. Timber was seen as an infinite resource and as such could be consumed in gargantuan quantities to make a statement at a funeral. But timber isn't infinite, we know that now. The UN Environment Programme's 2020 report, The State of the World's Forests, makes for a bitter and terrifying read. And Hector's funeral is far from the only episode in the poem portraying abusively aggressive logging. There are watchfires and foundry fires burning profligate amounts of timber. There are far more than 1,000 Greek ships, each equipped with dozens of benches, oars and pikes. And the vast number is emphasised by the inclusion of the information that in a previous assault on Troy, Heracles had taken the city with only 6 ships. And the very epithets for the ships reveal the craft work that went into making them. They're well-benched, curving, hollow, as well as simply black. Meriones kills Phereclus, son of Tecton, Harmon's son, the master carpenter loved by Athena, goddess of handicraft. He'd also built for Paris the shapely ships, source of evil, that became the bane of all the Trojans. And there are other funerals, including that of Patroclus, for whom the Achaeans climbed the spurs of Mount Ida with its many fountains and chopped down a vast number of high-crested oak trees to make a pyre 100 foot square. In Book 7 there's a mass funeral for the Greek dead, and that involves the collection of even more wood. This is followed by the building of the Greeks' wall, complete with gates and wooden pikes planted densely in the peripheral trench. Their huts are not tents but elaborate wooden edifices. The Myrmidons built for Achilles a lofty hut hewing fir beams roofed with thatch gathered from the meadows, surrounded by a great court with thick-set pales and a door barred by a single enormous fir log. Now, in 1953, Fairfield Osborne wrote in The Limits of the Earth that the history of Greece and Rome assumes the character of a prologue to modern times. And environmentalists such as Clive Ponting, in A New History of the World, 1991, and John Perlin in A Forest Journey, The Rise of Wood in the Development of Civilization, and Jared Diamond's Collapse, 2005, they've all suggested that ancient societies caused their own collapse by destroying supportive environments, for example, by deforestation. The influential American literary critic Frederick Jameson proposed that art always has a political unconscious because it always has a relationship with the power relationships, labour systems and processes of production in the society that produced it. And art can always be read to disclose those conflicts and contradictions inherent in that society. And I'm now inspired by the idea that the political unconscious is accompanied by an ecological unconscious, in which case any artwork can be read to reveal contemporary attitudes to the environment. The Iliad can reveal that at some deep level, the ancient Greeks in the period which produced it, in development over those long centuries between the Bronze Age and the 8th century, were indeed aware that their relationship with nature had changed irrevocably, and that the change was linked to the possibility of environmental catastrophe. Somewhat later, there were certainly classical Greeks who were uncomfortable with the human degradation of the natural environment. Myths evolved narrating the terrible punishments suffered by people who disrespected trees, such as Erysichthon, who cut down poplar trees sacred to Demeter simply to build an unnecessary extension to his palace. Now, he was consequently doomed to devour his own body in terrible hunger. And Aristotle commented on the need for special wardens to keep wood supplies and forests sustainable. He'd also observed that a species of scallop had been rendered extinct by overdredging. But such concerns did not and have never since translated into sufficient action to avert the wrecking of our ecosystem. Now, the word Anthropocene was coined in precisely 2000. Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer proposed that the changes humans had wrought in the global environment were of such geological and ecological significance that the current term they used to describe our epoch, the Holocene, had outlived its usefulness. And the beginning of the Holocene is placed at the end of the last glacial period. Now, the idea of the Anthropocene has caught on in public discourse, but there remains debate about when it started. Proposals range from the mid-18th century Industrial Revolution all the way back to the end of the Pleistocene epoch and the Agricultural Revolution in Mesopotamia at least 10,000 years ago. But many experts actually propose the period from which the Iliad emerged, when unprecedentedly intensive deforestation took place for shipbuilding, mining and smelting, and livestock grazing. Homeric epic with its 1,000+ ships, clashing bronze and endless hecatombs can be read as one of the earliest and most powerful files in the archive of human destructiveness. It can even be said that it's the text that inaugurated modern consciousness and the breakdown of the prehistoric bicameral mind. Until the Neolithic Revolution, the landscapes of the Mediterranean evolved very slowly. Humans played almost no role. It was agriculture that made humans the most important shapers of landscapes. Before the beginnings of plant domestication, the human population was around 6 million. But by 1200 BCE, around the date when the Iliad set, it had grown to 100 million. Hunter-gatherers had already set fire to woods to open up meadows to attract prey. And already in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu moves to the city after helping Gilgamesh kill Humbaba, the giant who guarded the forest. They cut down his cedars. And the Israelites used massive amounts of cedar logs to build the Temple of Jerusalem. But it was the ancient Greeks and Romans who transformed the landscape of the Mediterranean and Black Sea worlds. Navies, pasturage, farming, mining and smelting voraciously devoured forest. 90% of fuel needs were met by timber. Massive deforestation accelerated between about 600 and 500, but the irrevocable damage had begun in the late Bronze Age. As Lucretius puts it, continuously men compelled the forests to withdraw higher up the mountains and to leave the lower slopes to civilization. Or, as the Scottish leader Calgacus says to the Romans in Tacitus, they make a desert and call it peace. Timber shortfalls probably contributed to the actual collapse of power in Minoan Crete. And the Mycenaeans depicted in the Iliad made things much worse by clearing land for sheep grazing and arable farming. Pollen samples show that pine forests grew around Pylos, Nestor's city on the Peloponnesian coast, in the 16th century. But nearby Messenia had at least 400 smiths turning out many tons of metal, and the pottery industry expanded enormously, and that needs vast amounts of fuel. As the economy expanded, so did the population in the late Bronze Age, especially the 13th century. Pollen studies and soil profiles record the toll on the forests of the Peloponnese caused by unprecedented economic and population growth. Palynology shows that in Greek mountain areas, the vegetation patterns were already changing in the Bronze Age, 2nd millennium. The coastal pine forest around Pylos was destroyed and turned into pasturage. Woodcutters had to move to the centre of the peninsula by the 13th century, and so did potters, who relocated to mountain slopes. The Cycladic island of Melos was entirely deforested, and this must all be connected with natural disasters that became much more common during the late Bronze Age. The newly treeless slopes above the plain of Argos sent earth and water raging downhill in rainy season. Mud-filled torrents and drought afflicted Tiryns and Navarino harbour. The soil was eroded, leaving it so short of nitrogen that it remains so to this day. Drought became much more common. The need for wood and grain certainly puts the value for the Mycenaeans of a symbol of eastward colonisation into perspective. And by the 3rd century CE, there was probably no extensive forest anywhere in the plains and low hills around the shoreline of the Mediterranean. Floods became increasingly common then, especially in the Tiber region. Deforestation led to soil erosion. Rome was flooded in 241 BCE and many times thereafter. Parts of North Africa that had once supported cities with baths, cisterns and bridges were abandoned. Classical civilization wrecked the environment. The microclimate changed, as Theophrastus records. The era that produced the Iliad heralded the Anthropocene by setting us on the technological path that would lead directly to the ecological disaster facing us today. So at some unconscious level, the poets of the Iliad, so aware that their song would be sung in the distant future by generations of men yet to come, as Helen tells Hector, already knew it. The Iliad offers unforgettable images of total destruction. Apollo kicks down the Achaeans' wall as easily as a child playing on the seashore who's built a house of sand, kicks it down and annihilates it. The poet describes how even the last vestiges of the Greek fortifications were obliterated after the war by Poseidon and Apollo, who inundated the shore for 9 long days before Poseidon smashed away every last beam and stone with his trident and made the coast of the Hellespont smooth again, covering the beach with sand. So the Iliad, composed about 2,750 years ago, opens by telling us that Achilles' wrath killed huge numbers of heroes, for Zeus's plan was being fulfilled. And an ancient scholar commented on that phrase. That scholar says that Earth begged Zeus to relieve her of the weight of the multitude of people who were impious. So Zeus first brought about the Theban War, which destroyed large numbers, and afterwards the Trojan one, with Momus as his advisor, that being what Homer calls the plan of Zeus, seeing he was capable of destroying everyone with thunderbolts or floods. Now Momus, or Blame, was the sinister son of Night and brother of Misery. He recommended as an alternative to thunder or floods the judgment of Paris. So the Trojan War came about, resulting in the lightning of the earth, as many were killed. This ancient scholar then quotes a fragment of the lost epic Cypria, composed shortly after the Iliad, which narrated the events preceding the war itself. There was a time when the countless tribes of humans roaming constantly over the land were weighing down the deep-breasted earth's expanse. Zeus took pity when he saw it. In his complex mind, he resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of mankind's weight by fanning the great conflict of the Trojan War to void the burden through death. So the warriors at Troy kept being killed and Zeus's plan was being fulfilled. And a similar tradition was recounted in the early epic Catalogue of Women, attributed to Homer's approximate coeval Hesiod. High thundering Zeus was devising wondrous deeds then to stir up trouble on the boundless earth, for he was already eager to annihilate most of the race of speech-endowed human beings. Hence he established for immortals and for mortal humans difficult warfare, pain upon pain. So the fall of Troy and the notion of apocalyptic threat to the survival of the human race has been linked in the mythical imagination since the late archaic age. And besides the pyres and ships and fortifications and fires for foundries, beacons and homes, there's a great deal of other timber in the actual action of the Iliad, most of it produced simply for the purposes of war and liable to swift and wasteful destruction, like the oak axles of the countless war chariots charging across the plain. Achilles' own enormous spear was made of ash from a tree on Mount Pelion. The forest-dwelling centaur Chiron had given it to Achilles' father Peleus for the slaughter of warriors. And Mount Pelion's supplies of ash were long ago depleted, but until recently its ash forest survived as one of the last densely wooded places in Greece. But in the summer of 2007, a fire destroyed a large proportion of Pelion's remaining trees. In Book 8, Hector orders the Trojans to gather an abundance of wood to make hundreds of watchfires. Moreover, he says, every house in Troy must build a great fire to ward off ambushes. These fires, we hear, burned in multitudes. It was like when in heaven the stars twinkle with great clarity around the shining moon, when the air is windless and all the mountain peaks are revealed and the steep headlands and the valleys, and the infinite air breaks open all the way to heaven, and all the stars are visible, and the shepherd is glad at heart. In such numbers gleamed the fires that the Trojans kindled in front of Ilium, between the ships and the streams of Xanthus. 1,000 fires burned on the plain, and by each one sat 50 men in the glow of the blazing fire. Now, warriors are sometimes likened to trees that survive buffeting by weather. The two Lapiths, for example, defending the Achaean fleet, stand firm like high-crested oaks in the mountains that always withstand the wind and the rain every single day, firm, fixed, with huge unbroken roots. But more often the warriors themselves, in the moment they're killed, are compared to trees being felled. When Ajax kills the Trojan youth Simoeisius, his victim fell to the ground in the dust like a poplar tree that's grown in the meadow of a great marsh, smooth-stemmed, but with branches growing from the top. Some chariot maker has cut it down with shining iron to make it grow. Some wheelwright felled it with gleaming iron to bend a curving wheel for a beautiful chariot, and it lies drying on a river's banks. Aeneas kills two twins, and they fell like lofty fir trees. Teucer kills Imbrius, who fell like an ash tree on the peak of a mountain that can be seen from a great distance around when it's cut down by the bronze and lowers its tender foliage to the ground. That is how he fell, and around him clanged his armour. When Idomeneus kills Asius, he fell as an oak falls, or a white poplar, or a tall pine, which carpenters cut down in the mountains with newly sharpened axes to make a ship. That was how he lay stretched in front of his horses and chariot, groaning, clutching at the bloody dust. And even Hector, when he briefly collapses, is compared to an oak tree uprooted by a lightning bolt emitting the stench of sulphur. And these images create an aural crescendo of insistently hammering axes and crashing tree trunks until the death of Sarpedon, who fell also, like Asius, as an oak falls or a white poplar or a tall pine which carpenters cut down in the mountains with newly sharpened axes to make a ship. That was how he lay stretched out, groaning and clutching at the bloody dust. And after Patroclus' death, Menelaus slaughters Euphorbus. As a man rears a robust olive sapling in an isolated place where water bubbles up amply, a fine sapling which flourishes and the gusts of all the winds make it vibrate and it teems with white blossom. But suddenly a wind comes upon it with a forceful hurricane and tears it from its furrow and stretches it out on the ground. Timber production penetrates to other realms of metaphor. Paris compares his unsympathetic brother's unyielding art to an axe that is driven through a beam by the hand of a man who skillfully shapes a ship's timber, and it adds to the force of his blow. When Hector and Paris arrive to support the Trojan militia, the sight is as delightful to the Trojans as the fair wind that a god gives to oarsmen in need when they're exhausted from striking the sea with polished oars of firwood. And the men become like trees themselves, as the east wind and the south compete to shake a deep wood in the glades of a mountain, a wood of beech and ash and smooth-barked cornel, and these clash their long boughs against one another with a terrifying din, and broken branches crash. When the Achaeans try to retrieve the corpse of Patroclus, they're likened to mules that drag down from the mountain a great log or a piece of timber for a ship. And in the long central sequence of fighting that ultimately leads up to the deaths of Sarpedon and Patroclus, the similes from the timber industry and also from natural disaster destroying forests, they accumulate apace, as if the rows of men are somehow fused with the rows of trees that had to be destroyed to make international military confrontation possible. Warriors are also now likened to natural forces, which we now know can be exacerbated by human activity, forces that spell ruin for woodland. Agamemnon on the rampage fells the heads of fleeing Trojans as when obliterating fire falls on a forest that has never been logged and the whirling wind carries it in every direction and the copses fall, torn up by the roots by the force of the onrushing fire. And Ajax is likened to a river in flood that sweeps away trees, as when a flooding river comes down into a plain, a winter torrent from the mountains that Zeus's rain drives on, and it carries many dry oak trees, many pine trees, hurling abundant debris into the sea. The combined war cries of Achaean and Trojan forces was louder than the waves of the sea under the onslaught of the north wind, but also as loud as the roar made by a blazing forest fire whose flames leap as they incinerate a forest in the mountain glades, and as loud as a wind roaring through the high crests of oak trees. And during the prolonged battle at the ships, the adversaries were so evenly matched that the effect resembled the even marking made by a carpenter's measuring tool as he straightens the timber plank of a ship. Hector rages like consuming fire that rages in the mountains and the thickets of a deep wood. And the battle over Patroclus' corpse, the din arose from both sides as the din of men who cut down oaks in the glens of a mountain. A sound arises that can be heard from afar. That was what the clanging was like as it arose from the broad-weight earth, the clanging of bronze and well-wrought shields. Humans are cut down like trees, sound like trees, grow up like trees, but they also threaten those trees, destroy forests, run like wildfire, wrecking an entire forest. Achilles rages like a dreadfully blazing fire, running through the deep vales of a parched mountainside, driven whirling on, and the black earth ran with blood. In the description of his shield, Achilles' fight with the river and the river's fight with Hephaestus' fire, the implication of man in nature simultaneously as its adversary, its wrecker, and its victim is crystallised as the very symbol of the Anthropocene, of Homo sapiens' irreconcilable relationship with nature. Now, a main reason for cutting down forests and woods was to clear land for pasturing animals. Between 1100 and 560 BCE, iron tools, especially the iron ploughshare, became widespread amongst Greek agriculturalists, allowing much denser and more heavily timbered soil to be domesticated for growing grain. A distance is compared to the range of mules in ploughing, for they are better than oxen to draw through the deep fallow land and the jointed plough. The two Iantes fought beside one another, as in fallow land, two wine-dark oxen together strain at the jointed plough. The streams of sweat ooze up around the roots of their horns as the pair are held apart only by the polished yoke as they labour through the furrow until the plough cuts to the end of the field. Combatants fight like reapers who, opposite one another, drive their swathes in a rich man's field of wheat or barley, and the handfuls fall thick and fast. The mighty defender Ajax is likened to an ass wrecking the high-growing grain crop in a field, who does not run off when boys hit him with cudgels. The wasteful destruction and utilisation of timber in the Iliad is nearly equalled by its accounts of livestock farming and meat consumption. The Iliad is also replete with fantastically forged and invaluable metal objects like the divine aegis, decorated with 100 golden tassels, all cunningly twisted, each one worth 100 oxen. Even more important in the acceleration of deforestation in the era of the Iliad was metallurgy, especially smelting and forging of iron on an industrial scale. Iron is used everywhere in the Iliad for everyday tools, knives, axes, implements of domestic and agricultural life. But the fuel needed to smelt iron was charcoal or wood baked, not burned, to extract its impurities, leaving only carbon. And 20 to 28 million hectares of trees were required to smelt enough to leave behind the 50 to 90 million tonnes of Iron Age slag found around the Mediterranean. The iron smelters of Populonia are said to have consumed on average 375 hectares of wood annually. Achilles orders a mass of iron and iron axes as prizes in the funeral games of Patroclus. Ownership of bronze, gold and iron, which requires much labour in the smithing or smelting, appears regularly as the recurrent epic formula for describing a wealthy man. When Adrastus begs Menelaus for his life, he says he can offer an infinite ransom, for his father has great treasure stores, bronze and gold and iron that requires much labour. Agamemnon tries to bribe Achilles to return to the fighting with 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 gleaming cauldrons, as well as 7 beautiful slave women. Nestor owns a 4-handled cup too heavy for men to lift today, studded with golden bosses and images of doves. Bronze is the metal from which arms and armour are made, though, because it could then be tempered much better than iron could. Bronze swords cleave heads and hack off limbs. But even bronze weapons break. Swords crack at the hilt when they strike shields or helmets. Menelaus' sword breaks into 3 or 4 pieces when he hits Paris's helmet ridge. So the acoustic backdrop of the entire epic Iliad is insistent clanging of bronze on bronze. This noun is clanger, as onomatopoeic as in English. The past tense of the verb is eklankse. And there are many hundred instances of formulaic lines and epithets about weaponry made of bronze, chalkos, with bronze breastplate, heavy with bronze, bronze-tipped, gleaming like bronze, armed with bronze, of the bronze helmet, bronze greaved, with bronze cheek pieces, bronze hoofed, bronze forged, bronze clad. The great cauldron in which water is boiled using vast amounts of timber to wash Patroclus' corpse is solid bronze. Even a loud voice metaphorically becomes a voice of bronze. The narrator wishes he had a heart of bronze to recount the names of every single soldier. The clang of metal begins with Apollo storming down from Olympus to shoot plague arrows at the Achaeans. The arrows rattled on the shoulders of the wrathful god as he moved, and he came like the night. The twang of his silver bow was terrible. And later we see Hephaestus, the great smith god, sweating at his anvil, kept alight by 20 bellows, his tools neatly lined up in a silver chest, massive hammer in one hand, tongs in the other, and he hammers Achilles' great bronze shield inlaid with gold and silver. But it's when Achilles finally returns to lead the Achaeans into battle that extravagant consumption of both timber and metal in the manufacturing of arms is most memorably described. The brightly gleaming helmets and embossed shields and the strong curving breastplates and the ashen spears are as dense as snowflakes. The gleam reached heaven, and the flashing bronze made the whole earth around laugh, and thudding arose from the feet of men. Achilles dons the arms Hephaestus has made him, the greaves fitted with silver ankle pieces, the breastplate, the bronze sword studded with silver. His great shield gleamed like the moon, or a fire on the mountain that sailors can see as storm winds drive them ever further from land. And his helmet with its golden plumes twinkled like a star. He felt free in his movements, the armour like wings that lifted him. And in that remarkable series of images that had set up the final day of fighting, the vast amounts of bronze that had poured from the ships was said to make that land laugh. And that's a very sinister touch, implying that nature itself feels vengeful joy in human self-destructiveness. Godlike Achilles, for all his grief, feels as if he can fly as he prepares himself for a day of slaughter, wrapped in his fabulous metal battle gear, and we're reminded of the cosmic entities, the moon and the stars. Man's relationship with nature is dysfunctional and conflicted. Man at war can resemble cosmic forces, and he's also at their mercy. But the secret at the heart of the Iliad is that nature is also at the mercy of man. Achilles drives some Trojans towards the city, but others into the river Scamander or Xanthus, which is crammed with men and chariots. He slaughters them, and the water turns red with blood, and now Scamander appears in human form and complains that he can no longer flow into the sea, so crammed with corpses are his streams. As Spenser put it in Fairy Queen, divine Scamander purpled yet with blood of Greeks and Trojans, which therein did die. And there ensues a terrifying showdown between man and river, which it is all too easy to read as a foreshadowing of ecological disasters to come. Achilles tears an elm tree up by the roots, tears away the bank with it, but the river pursues him across the plain, inundating it. The corpses now float on the surface where land has been. Scamander asks his brother river, the Simois, to fight with him. They seethe and boil against Achilles. Everything is about to disappear forever beneath their torrents. But Hera quickly tells Hephaestus to respond with fire, and he dries out the plain and then turns on Scamander, burning the elms and the willows, the tamarisks, the lotus, the rushes and the galingale that grew abundantly on the banks. The very fish are burned alive. And in July 2021, the world was appalled to see images of the sea itself apparently ablaze when a gas leak from an underwater pipeline in the Gulf of Mexico caused a fiery inferno to take place on the surface of the ocean, and it couldn't be extinguished for 5 hours. The heroes of the Iliad are locked in momentous combat, not only with each other, but with the elements themselves. And in Achilles' struggle with flood and Flood's struggle with fire, we can feel an anticipation of the ecological catastrophes that yet await us. So, in conclusion, reading the Iliad ecologically gives us a new interpretation of this timeless poem to add to the previous shifts in meaning and repurposing across time. But what I want to do is to encourage the epic's readers to action in our current battle for the survival of our planet's ecosystems. We need Achilles to go green. I began with the 9-day collection of logs from Mount Ida to build Hector's funeral pyre at the end of the Iliad. And I want to end on a cautiously optimistic note. The trees of Mount Ida have recently been protected at least temporarily from renewed devastation by the mining industry. Part of the area was declared to be a national park in 1993, but the Turkish state subsequently sold land and mining rights for an enormous sum to the Canadian mining company Alamos Gold. And the proposed mining project is just 20 kilometres from Troy. And in 2017, the Turkish partner of the company began felling thousands of trees and removing the entire soil down to the bare rock. 200,000 trees were cut down. Cyanides began to be used for gold extraction, putting drinking water supplies at risk. But the extent of the tree clearance and destruction of natural environments was detected by satellites and drones collected by a Turkish environmental organisation, and a huge protest camp was set up in 2019. Operations were successfully stalled and the Turkish government removed Alamos's mining licences. Now, the company has responded by registering a claim against the Republic of Turkey with the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. But people's action has worked. It has, for the time being, saved some of the last remaining forests of Mount Ida, where the wood, regardless of what Homer's heroes say, never has been infinite. Thank you very much.